What's going on, everybody? Kalipus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the Motorola Moto G 5G and the Motorola Moto G Stylus 5G 2021. Now, before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing and availability. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Moto G 5G, we're getting a 6.5-inch 90Hz IPS LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 270, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and an 81.4% screen-to-body ratio. With the Moto G Stylus 5G, we're getting a 6.8-inch IPS LCD display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 386, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and an 84.8% screen-to-body ratio. So both of these phones do have pretty good displays for what they are, but I would say the Moto G Stylus 5G does have a bit of an advantage here. First of all, as you can see, the Moto G Stylus 5G is a bit larger, which tends to be a good thing when you're consuming a lot of content. And in addition to this, with a 1080p resolution versus 720p, the Moto G Stylus is going to have a much sharper image, which is also going to give you a better experience overall. That being said, one advantage the Moto G 5G does have is it has a 90Hz refresh rate, whereas the Moto G Stylus 5G only has a standard 60Hz display. So with a higher refresh rate, the movement on the screen with the Moto G 5G is going to be a little bit faster and smoother. So if you're doing something with motion on the screen like watching a video or playing a game, or just navigating through your phone in general, you will get a slightly better experience, and it's going to feel a little bit more premium. But that being said, compared to having a larger screen with a higher resolution, having a 90Hz display versus 60Hz is really more of a subtle difference. So again, in general, although the Moto G 5G doesn't really have a bad display, and it does have at least that one little advantage, if the display is really a priority for you, I would still say the Moto G Stylus 5G does have the advantage here. Now for storage, with the Moto G 5G, we're getting 256GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, and with the Moto G Stylus 5G, we're getting 128GB with microSD card expansion as well. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, in this specific comparison, this Moto G 5G in my hand is factory unlocked, and this Moto G Stylus 5G is from Cricket, and the carrier versions of these phones do tend to have a little bit less storage. So keep in mind, if you get an unlocked version of the Moto G Stylus 5G, you will get 256GB instead, so in that case, it will be equal. But again, for the purpose of this comparison, this is the unlocked version of the Moto G 5G that does have 256GB, and this Moto G Stylus 5G does only have 128. But that being said, either way, I feel like for most people, 128GB should be perfectly fine. But that being said, if you are more of a power user, if you have a lot of apps and photos and videos and stuff like that, then the Moto G 5G will probably have a bit of an advantage here. But again, the advantage really isn't that big because you can get a 256GB variant of the Moto G Stylus 5G as well. And again, keep in mind, both phones do have microSD card expansion, so if you want to offload photos and videos, for example, you can always do that too. Now for security features, both phones have fingerprint scanners as well as face unlock. With the Moto G 5G, the fingerprint scanner is right here on the power key, and with the Moto G Stylus 5G, it's right here on the back. But that being said, starting with the Moto G 5G, let's go ahead and give these fingerprint scanners a try and see how well they work. There we go, one more time. And there we go. And moving on to the Moto G Stylus 5G. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see there, both fingerprint scanners were real fast and responsive, no issues at all. And remember, both phones also have face unlock, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setups here, with the Moto G 5G, we got a nice looking hole punch design for the front facing camera, and this camera is 13 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel ultra wide camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. With the Moto G Stylus 5G, we got another hole punch design for the front facing camera, and this camera is 16 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a quad camera setup with a 48 megapixel main camera, an 8 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 5 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So as far as features go, both of these phones are pretty good, but I would say the Moto G Stylus 5G does have an advantage since this phone does have an ultra wide camera, and unfortunately the Moto G 5G doesn't. And the same kind of thing goes for quality. Despite the Moto G 5G being newer and having a slightly higher megapixel main camera, I would say in general, the Moto G Stylus 5G does take slightly higher quality photos, so if the camera really is a top priority for you, then I would say the Moto G Stylus 5G is the way to go. But that being said, if you're more of a casual camera user, maybe you don't really care about having an ultra wide camera, and you just want to get a couple nice Instagram photos or something every now and then, the Moto G 5G will still absolutely get the job done. As far as RAM and processor go, with the Moto G 5G, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor. With the Moto G Stylus 5G, we're getting 4GB of RAM with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 480 5G processor. Now keep in mind, again, this is the Cricket version of the Moto G Stylus 5G, and if you get this phone factory unlocked, you will get 6GB instead. But that being said, I did run Geekbench 5 benchmark tests on both of these phones, and with the Moto G 5G, we're getting a single core score of 545 and a multi-core score of 1684, and with the Moto G Stylus 5G, we're getting a single core score of 502 and a multi-core score of 1662. So in general, as you can see here, these phones are actually pretty similar as far as processing power goes, and in my experience, you're really not going to notice much of a difference. In general, these phones can handle pretty much any kind of basic activities like web browsing, social media use, streaming content like videos and music, and even a good amount of mobile gaming. And while these phones are not going to be nearly as fast as something like a $1,400 flagship phone, for example, or even an upper-end mid-range phone like a Samsung Galaxy A53 5G, I still do think these phones will be plenty fast enough for most people. But that being said, I do recommend running this test on your current phone and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of whether or not one of these phones will be an upgrade for you. Because if you're coming from a lower-end device, then I do think either of these phones will be a significant upgrade, but if you're coming from something like an older flagship phone, for example, then it might be a different story. But again, in general, these phones are really not that different as far as processing power goes, and no matter which one you get, you're not really going to see a significant performance difference between the two either way. Now, these phones have pretty much the exact same battery specs, with 5000 mAh batteries supporting 10-watt fast charging, so while the fast charging isn't really the best in the world, both of these phones do have really large batteries, so if battery life and longevity is a priority for you, you're not going to go wrong with either of them. As far as other features go, unfortunately, neither of these phones have NFC, so if you like to make contactless mobile payments using tap and pay, definitely keep this in mind because you're not going to be able to do that with either of these phones. Now, as the name suggests, one thing the Moto G Stylus 5G has that the Moto G 5G doesn't is a stylus. Now, as far as the quality of this stylus goes, it's not the best stylus in the world, and compared to something like a Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra, for example, it's not going to be near that level, so don't expect to be able to do any actual art on it or anything. But for just doing basic activities like taking handwritten notes, navigating through the phone, and maybe playing a game or two, it will get the job done. So if you do like doing stuff like taking handwritten notes and you want a phone that has a stylus, but you still don't want to pay $1,400 for a flagship phone, then that's another great advantage of the Moto G Stylus 5G. But in conclusion, which of these phones is better? In general, in almost every way, I would say the Moto G Stylus 5G is the better device here, except for the Moto G 5G having 256GB of internal storage and the Moto G Stylus 5G only having 128. There's really not a single advantage the Moto G 5G has over the Moto G Stylus 5G. And keep in mind, again, that advantage is really more based on the variants, because again, there is a 256GB variant of the Moto G Stylus 5G too, you just have to get it unlocked and not through a carrier. But other than that, the Moto G Stylus 5G does have a nicer looking display that's also a lot larger. It takes better quality photos, has an ultra-wide camera, has pretty much the same level of performance despite the Moto G 5G being a newer phone, and the Moto G Stylus 5G does have a stylus as well. And another thing to keep in mind is that while the Moto G 5G is definitely a really affordable 5G phone, since this version of the Moto G Stylus 5G is a little bit older, I have been seeing a lot of really good deals on it. So in general, I feel like you're more likely to find this phone for a better deal than the Moto G 5G. But that being said, if you can somehow find the Moto G 5G for free or something, or at least for significantly cheaper than the Moto G Stylus 5G, I really don't think this phone is a bad option either. But again, in general, pricing equalized, I do think the Moto G Stylus 5G is a significantly better phone in pretty much every way. But this concludes my comparison between the Motorola Moto G 5G and the Motorola Moto G Stylus 5G 2021. Once again, if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing and availability because this is always changing. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.